Hi, this is David Bennett with the North Carolina Maritime Museum System, and today I'm going to talk about Lieutenant William Cushing and the destruction of the CSS Albemarle. So, CSS Albemarle was a steam-powered ironclad in the Confederate Navy named after the Albemarle Sound here in North Carolina. The Confederate Navy ordered the construction of the ironclad in April 1862. The ship was built in a cornfield along the Roanoke River at Edwards Ferry near Halifax, North Carolina. Gilbert Elliott, a young man and the manager of the Perquimans County shipyard, oversaw the construction of the ship. He was assisted by Commander James Cook, who would go on to become the Albemarle's first captain and lead the ship into combat. The Albemarle was armed with two Brooks guns, but its primary weapon was its ram at the bow of the ship, designed to knock holes in wooden vessels. The Albemarle was completed on April 17th, 1864, just in time to play an important role in the Battle of Plymouth. The Battle of Plymouth began on April 17th, 1864, when Confederate forces laid siege to the Union garrison at Plymouth, a small port town on the Roanoke River in Washington County, North Carolina. The Union Army, with the assistance of naval gunboats, held the town against multiple Confederate attacks. The tide of the battle, however, changed when CSS Albemarle arrived and engaged the wooden gunboats. The Albemarle rammed the USS Southfield, sinking the ship within minutes. All the while, rounds fired from the Union gunboats bounced off the Albemarle's armor with little to no effect. A shell fired from the USS Miami ricocheted off the Albemarle's iron plating and came straight back, killing its commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Flusser. With no way to defeat the ironclad, Union gunboats withdrew from the Roanoke River, leaving the Union garrison surrounded and cut off. By April 20th, Confederate soldiers overran Plymouth with naval gunfire support from the Albemarle. Union reports later credited the loss of Union gunboats as a pivotal moment in the battle that had a direct impact on the loss of the town. Following the Battle of Plymouth, CSS Albemarle went into the Albemarle Sound with the intention of traveling to Newbern to participate in a siege of the city. There it was confronted by Union gunboats, and an epic naval battle erupted. Again, Union gunboats pummeled the ironclad with shells with little to no effect. At one point in the battle, USS Sassacus rammed the Albemarle. The Albemarle was finally forced to withdraw and return to Plymouth after its smokestack was riddled with holes, and it lost the draft over its boiler, causing the fire to die down and thus causing the ship to lose speed. The Albemarle remained in Plymouth, acting as a deterrent against the Union Navy from coming up the Roanoke River. U.S. naval leaders feared that the ironclad would emerge again from Roanoke and wreak havoc, so they committed U.S. naval vessels to the Albemarle Sound to challenge CSS Albemarle should the need arise. This, however, drew sailors and resources away from more active theaters of conflict. This situation was unacceptable, so U.S. naval leadership were left with a question: how to destroy the Albemarle. So it was believed a conventional attack involving wooden gunboats would be too risky. The USS Southfield had been lost in battle to the Albemarle, and other gunboats failed to have much effect on the ironclad. The Navy couldn't afford to lose more ships in any sort of futile attack. A more viable option was some sort of unconventional attack. On May 25th, 1864, while naval leaders racked their brain for a solution, a five-man team from USS Wyalusing, consisting primarily led by Charles Baldwin, John Lloyd, Alexander Crawford, and a couple other men, attempted to destroy CSS Albemarle. Baldwin and Lloyd swam across the Roanoke River just above Plymouth with a line and hauled two 100-pound explosives to the Plymouth side of the river, where they connected the two explosives with a bridle and allowed them to drift down the river, and were guided into place by Baldwin, who swam with them. Crawford, stationed in the swamp on the opposite side of the river, would detonate the charge when signaled. Baldwin made it within a few yards of the ship before he was spotted by a sentry and came under heavy musket fire. Fortunately, Baldwin and his companions escaped. Although unsuccessful, the 5 men received the Medal of Honor. More importantly, the incident illustrated that a small team armed with explosives could infiltrate behind enemy lines and undermine a warship. The USS Baldwin is named after Charles Baldwin, who participated in the operation. Rather than utilize swimmers, Union naval leaders were more interested in using sailors and Marines and small boats to conduct a raid to either capture or destroy the Albemarle. The problem was finding someone daring enough to attempt such a mission. The name that came to the mind, the name that came to mind of naval leaders was that of Lieutenant William Barker Cushing, a young maverick who was not cut from the same cloth as most naval officers of his day. He was bold, daring, impulsive. He seemed to have a general disdain for rules and continuously pushed the limits. Some of these attributes may be useful for a young officer in a time of war, but they didn't endear him to a peacetime Navy. Prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, Cushing attended the United States Naval Academy, but he didn't get along with his instructors for the personality traits I just described. He pulled pranks and misbehaved, and he was expelled just a few months before graduation and on the eve of the Civil War. He was excited for failing a Spanish midterm exam, which seems a little extreme, and the Academy did not believe that he would make a good officer, and that's probably the main reason he was kicked out. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Cushing's family and friends pleaded with Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, to have Cushing reinstated. With war looming, they were successful, and Cushing was made an officer in the United States Navy. So Cushing was very successful in his early career, and by age 19, he was placed in his first command, USS Ellis, where he just continued to show that he was an outstanding officer and warrior. A fun fact, before USS Ellis was USS Ellis, it was CSS Ellis. And its original commander was none other than Commander James Cook, who would eventually become captain, who was later on at the Battle of Plymouth captain of the CSS Albemarle. Ellis was the CSS Ellis was captured by Union forces near Elizabeth City in 1862 and re-entered service in the Union Navy as USS Ellis. So just sort of funny how there's all these connections between different people in relation to the Albemarle. Cushing went on to have other commands. He had the USS Monticello, but what really set Cushing apart and what really caused him to gain notoriety was him conducting operations behind enemy lines in small boats. Some of these operations consisted of reconnaissance, intelligence gathering, destruction or capture of enemy ships, raiding shore installations, and capturing enemy combatants. On one occasion, he tried to capture a Confederate general, only to find that he wasn't home. Instead, he took another officer prisoner. Consequently, he became infamous amongst the enemy. It was Cushing's use of small boats, as I just mentioned, that really garnered the attention of Union naval leaders when they were looking for someone to lead a raid on CSS Albemarle. And when Cushing was asked to lead the attack on the Albemarle, he accepted the mission. Possibly a powerful motivating factor for Cushing uh, going up against the Albemarle was the fact that his best friend and mentor, Lieutenant Commander Flusser, was killed in action while fighting the Albemarle at the Battle of Plymouth. As I mentioned previously, a gun aboard the USS Miami, which was Flusser's flagship, fired an exploding shell at the Albemarle, only to have it ricochet off the armor plating and come back at the Miami. Flusser was killed instantly in the explosion. Cushing took Flusser's death personally and vowed to avenge his friend's death. Not only had Cushing lost his best friend to the war, but he also lost his brother Alonzo Cushing just a year before at the Battle of Gettysburg. Alonzo was an artillery officer who made a heroic last stand defending his position at Cemetery Ridge. During the engagement, he was severely wounded, but refused to leave his position. He continued to deliver devastating fire on the enemy until he was struck dead by an enemy bullet. His actions allowed Union forces to repel the Confederate attack. In 2014, Alonzo Cushing was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor by President Obama. So later on, William Cushing, that is, met with naval leaders to work out a plan for eliminating CSS Albemarle. Cushing wanted to lead a raid consisting of 80 men to capture the Albemarle. They would surprise and overpower the crew, cut the ironclad loose, and either steam or drift down the Roanoke River. Cushing's superiors thought this was a terrible idea and that would get everyone killed. Instead, Admiral Lee and other leaders thought that a better, more realistic plan would be to use either small rubber boats or a tugboat armed with spar torpedoes to sink the Albemarle. Fortunately, this idea won out. So Cushing was ordered to head north to procure the materials needed for his mission. While in New York, Cushing approached William Wood, Chief Engineer of the United States Navy, for advice on how to sink an ironclad. Wood convinced Cushing that he should use steam-powered launches in his operation. Two were under construction at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. Each were about 30 feet in length and could mount a small howitzer as well as a spar torpedo. Wood also introduced Cushing to Assistant Engineer George Melville, who set him up with spar torpedoes. The spar torpedo simply consisted of a long pole with a bomb at the end of it. A mechanism would release the bomb or torpedo, and the explosive would float under the hull of a ship. The explosive would then be triggered to blow a hole in a ship's hull and then thus hopefully sinking it. The torpedo itself consisted of a cylinder with a conical shape at the lower extreme. A tube ran through the middle of the cylinder with a percussion cap at the lower end, and a metal ball was at the upper end of the tube, held in place by a pin. To trigger the explosive, the pin was released by yanking on a lanyard. Then the metal ball would drop down the tube, hit the percussion cap, causing it to explode, thus igniting the black powder, resulting in a much larger explosion. The bottom portion of the torpedo was filled with black powder, which weighed it down, and the upper part, which black powder was also explosive, and the upper part was hollow, providing some buoyancy so that the torpedo would assume a vertical position in the water once released from the spar. And while Cushing was in New York, he trained with spar torpedoes to prepare for his mission. When Cushing was ready, he steamed his launch, Picket Boat Number 1, from New York all the way to North Carolina. Um, Acting Ensign Andrew Stockholm came down separately with a crew in picket boat number 2. Between Baltimore and Hampton Roads, picket boat number 2 ran into engine trouble, and the crew put into a creek to make repairs. While working on the engine, they were ambushed by Confederate guerrillas. After the crew ran out of ammunition, they surrendered. When picket boat number 2 didn't arrive, no one knew what had become of it, and Cushing was forced to go look for it. And he was unsuccessful, didn't find any trace of it. Of course, this delayed the operation, which really embittered Cushing. Not only that, but the loss of picket boat number 2 potentially threatened the success of the mission. After all, the boat and crew were traveling to North Carolina to embark on a mission to destroy the Albemarle. Um, Under interrogation, they might divulge their intentions to the enemy. Naturally, naval leadership were upset with the loss of this boat and its crew. They also questioned Cushing's ability to accomplish the mission with just one boat. Um, and Furthermore, when Cushing showed up in North Carolina, he was not in the best of health, which raised concerns with naval leaders. He had traveled all the way from New York in an open boat. His nutrition at times poor, and the elements had really taken a toll on him. So Cushing's new commanding officer, Admiral David Porter, had lost confidence in him, writing to Commander Macomb, "I have directed Lieutenant Cushing to go down in a steam launch and, if possible, destroy this ram with torpedoes. I have no great confidence in his success, but you will afford him all the assistance in your power and keep boats ready to pick him up in case of failure." Admiral Porter went as far as to make plans for engaging the Albemarle with wooden boats. Um, that, that's how that's how much Porter didn't trust or believe that Cushing could actually be successful. He thought Cushing was going to his death. On October 26th, 1864, Cushing embarked on his mission, but quickly called it off after his launch was stopped by a Union picket who had hurt his engine. Cushing went back and decided to muffle the engine by building a box around it and covering it up with a tarp. Meanwhile, runaway slaves had provided intelligence on the guard around the Albemarle. A schooner was tied to the wreckage of the USS Southfield with Confederate troops aboard to provide early warning of Union vessels approaching Plymouth. Cushing decided to add a second boat to his operation. He would tow a cutter behind him with 13 men aboard to deal with Confederate pickets. On the night of October 27th, 1864, Lieutenant Cushing launched his operation. It was a cool, cloudy night with intermittent rain. 14 men accompanied Cushing in the launch. Another 13 men were in tow. Cushing believed that if they could avoid being spotted by sentries, his crew could board the Albemarle, capture it, and steam down the Roanoke River and into the Albemarle Sound. The operation was conducted in complete silence. To communicate, Cushing had 3 lines in his right hand. One line went to Engineer Stotesbury. One pull of the rope meant speed up. 2 pulls meant bring engines to a stop. Tugging on one line going to acting mastermate Holworth meant start firing the howitzer on the bow. A pull of a rope to Ensign Gay meant ready to spar torpedo. And after several hours of cruising down the Roanoke River, Cushing and his crew came upon the wreckage of USS Southfield. They came within 20 yards of the ship, expecting to be spotted by the Confederate pickets, but no one took notice, and they proceeded farther up the river to Plymouth. At 3 a.m. on October 28th, they came upon CSS Albemarle. It seemed as though they might be able to board the ironclad until a dog started barking, alerting a sentry. The sentry shouted a challenge, When the proper answer was not returned, alarm bells started ringing and prearranged bonfires along the shoreline were lit, illuminating the river and the Albemarle. Um, then the shooting started. The launch cast off from the cutter and headed back to the South Field to deal with pickets. The light from the bonfires revealed that the Albemarle was surrounded by a ring of logs, chained together, providing a protective barrier designed to prevent a torpedo attack. This took Cushing by surprise. Prior reconnaissance missions had reported the log barrier, but somehow this detail was never shared with Cushing. Cushing ran the boat along the log barrier, turned around, and steamed towards the opposite shore. He then turned the boat 180 degrees, aimed the boat right at the Albemarle, and ordered full speed. When the boat struck the log barrier, the boat popped on top of it. The small howitzer on board the launch fired a load of canister shot to clear the Albemarle's deck. Ensign Gay then began to position the spar torpedo. While Cushing's crew were struggling to get the torpedo in place, the crew aboard the Albemarle went to work on positioning their gun. So finally, the torpedo slipped beneath the Albemarle's hull, and Cushing detonated the explosive. Almost simultaneously, the Albemarle fired its gun, missing because the gun could not be lowered enough. But when Cushing and his crew were then ordered to surrender, Cushing refused. He told his men to save themselves before diving into the Roanoke. That night, the water was really cold, and the men were wearing wool uniforms, weighed down by their wet clothes and taxed by the cold. The men struggled to swim. Acting mastermate John Woodman struggled to stay afloat. Cushing tried to help him, but the cold and exhaustion, he just couldn't maintain his grip on his fellow sailor, and Woodman slipped beneath the water and drowned. Cushing continued to swim until he reached land and collapsed with exhaustion. The next morning, he awoke to find that he was on the Plymouth side of the river, and Confederate soldiers were combing the area looking for him. Cushing moved about, avoiding patrols, until he found a black man and asked him to find out what had become of the Albemarle. In the confusion of the fight, Cushing didn't have time to observe the damage that he had inflicted on the Albemarle. When the man returned, he reported that the ironclad was sunk. At that point, Cushing attempted to make his escape by stealing a flat-bottom skiff that was on Conaby Creek, and he rowed it for 10 hours straight down the creek, all the way to the Roanoke River and into the Albemarle Sound, where he was picked up by USS Valley City and transferred to USS Shamrock. The red star on the map indicates approximately where Cushing stole the skiff and began his escape. Conaby Creek is really narrow and starts to widen up as you go north, and it twists and turns like a snake. And it would have been a long, difficult paddle for him, especially considering he hadn't had anything in terms of food or water, and had been exposed to the elements, and was completely exhausted at this point. So shortly after the destruction of CSS Albemarle, the Union Navy returned to Plymouth and retook the town on October 31st, 1864. For his actions, Cushing received the thanks of Congress, which was a formal resolution passed by Congress recognizing him for his heroic acts. During the Civil War, only 30 officers received this honor. He was also promoted to the rank of lieutenant commander and awarded $50,000 in prize money. The enlisted men who accompanied Cushing on the mission received the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor at this time in American history was only awarded to enlisted men. Officers were not eligible for this honor. The sinking of the Albemarle made Cushing an instant celebrity, and he became a household name almost overnight. Parties were held in his honor. He was invited to give speeches at a variety of venues. He was featured in newspapers across the United States. There is even a rush on obtaining prints of his photo and other mementos. After Union forces recaptured Plymouth, the wreckage of the Albemarle was raised from the bottom of the Roanoke. Once salvaged, the ironclad was taken to Norfolk, where it was eventually scrapped. After the war, Cushing did a deployment overseas to Asia. He had the opportunity to pick just about any command he wanted, and he really wanted to go out and see the world. So he went and went to Asia, but along the way he was in South America, South Africa, and a variety of other countries. When he returned home, he married his sweetheart Catherine Forbes in 1870. Uh, when William Cushing's life was cut short, and his final days were not spent in comfort. When he returned home from his last tour of duty, which was in the Caribbean, he was a shell of his former self. He was gaunt, he was angry, tired, and he was suffering from this somewhat mysterious back and hip pain, which was quite severe. The pain began shortly after his success against the Albemarle, but gradually grew worse throughout his post-war career. Eventually, he became delirious with pain, and his wife had him committed to the government hospital for the insane, where he slipped into a coma, and he died in December of 1874 at the age of 32. No one is sure of what killed Cushing. Did he have some sort of service-related injury? Was it some sort of infection, cancer? No one's sure what happened to him. When Cushing died, his body was laid in a vault at the Congressional Cemetery. It was laid in a vault at the Congressional Cemetery for 3 weeks before finally being interred at the U.S. Naval Academy Cemetery. Cushing's name lived on with a series of U.S. naval warships named in his honor. The Navy's first ever torpedo boat, built in 1890, was named after Cushing. And then there were a series of destroyers that were named in his honor. Well, thanks for checking out this video. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Have a great day. Bye.